September 19th, 1944, 7:30 in the morning. A thick fog rolled across the fields near Rechicourt-le-Petit in the Lorraine region of France, swallowing everything beyond 30 meters. Inside a Panther tank of the German 113th Panzer Brigade, the commander pressed his eye to the cupola and saw nothing but gray. Then, for one instant, the mist broke. What he saw made no sense. An American vehicle, low and fast, had appeared from nowhere, fired twice, and vanished before his gunner could even swing the turret halfway toward it. 50 meters to his left, a sister Panther burned. This was not an illusion. 42 Panthers had rolled into these fields that morning, certain of their superiority. Their crews had been told again and again that American armor was clumsy, poorly built, crewed by amateurs who won only through numbers. In the fog around Aricourt, that certainty was about to die. The vehicle hunting them was small, thin-skinned, and almost defenseless by German standards. Whatever it was, it had no business surviving contact with a Panther, and yet somehow it was the Panthers that kept burning. The fog had settled over Lorraine like something alive, thick and gray, folding itself into every hedgerow and ditch between Rechicourt-le-Petit and the small crossroads town the Americans called Aricourt. Inside his Panther, the commander of the lead platoon checked his watch. 7:15. His crew had been awake since 3 in the morning, engines idling low to conserve fuel, breath fogging in the cold cabin air. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, one of thousands of German tankers who had learned to fight and survive against Soviet armor in the brutal campaigns around Kursk and the Ukraine. He had watched T-34s burn by the dozen. He had watched his own comrades burn too. But always, in the end, German steel and German gunnery had prevailed. That was the lesson the war had taught him, and it was the lesson that made this morning's advance feel almost routine. 42 Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade crept forward through the mist at barely 5 miles an hour, the drivers straining to see more than a few car lengths ahead. The brigade had been formed only weeks earlier, on the 4th of September, thrown together from replacement crews and refitted vehicles, then rushed to the front near Sarrebourg by the 16th. Many of its men, like their platoon commander, had survived years of fighting in the East, and they carried that experience with them like a kind of armor of its own, a quiet certainty that no Western opponent could match what they had already lived through. Command had told them what to expect. Scattered Sherman tanks, thin infantry screens, no serious anti-tank defenses in the sector. German intelligence, gathered in haste and confidence, had missed something entirely. It had missed the small, fast, oddly shaped vehicles that had rolled into position near Rechicourt-le-Petit before dawn, engines silent, crews watching the tree line with the stillness of men who already knew what was coming. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper commanded one such platoon, 4 M18 Hellcats of Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 4th Armored Division. His men had trained for months on a philosophy that would have struck most German tank crews as reckless, even suicidal. Do not meet armor with armor. Do not trade blow for blow against a heavier, better protected opponent. Instead, use speed. Use concealment. Strike from an angle the enemy cannot easily cover, then vanish before he can respond. It was a doctrine born not on any battlefield, but in the mind of an American officer named Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, who in December of 1941 had been given command of a new tank destroyer center at Fort Meade, Maryland, and told to solve a problem that had haunted American planners since the fall of France. German armored columns had shattered the French army in 6 weeks. Bruce studied the reports of that collapse not as a traditionalist looking for a bigger gun or thicker plate, but as an engineer looking for a different answer altogether. His conclusion, radical for its time, was that a vehicle built to prioritize speed, firepower, and a well-trained crew, in that order, could defeat a heavier opponent by refusing to fight on the heavier opponent's terms. Armor protection, the value that German designers treated as sacred, would rank a distant 4th on Bruce's list of priorities. It was a philosophy that would have been dismissed as madness within the German high command, where each new tank, from the Panzer III to the Panther to the emerging Tiger II, added weight, thickness, and firepower in an unbroken march toward heavier steel. Bruce believed the opposite lesson could be drawn from the very campaigns that had produced that heavier steel. Speed had broken France, not armor thickness, and a vehicle fast enough to dictate the terms of every engagement would never need to survive a fair fight, because it would never allow one to happen in the first place. Few men in the Ordnance Department believed the idea would survive contact with reality, but Bruce pushed it through anyway, certain that a war of movement rewarded the side willing to think differently about what a tank was for. The vehicle that emerged from Bruce's doctrine took shape quickly. Ordnance officers called for a fast tank destroyer riding on a torsion bar suspension, powered by a radial engine borrowed from American aircraft design, armed at first with a light gun and eventually with a 76mm cannon capable of punishing most German armor at reasonable range. By July of 1943, the first production vehicles rolled off the line at Buick's plant in Flint, Michigan. They weighed barely 20 tons, less than two-thirds the weight of a Panther, yet carried nearly the same powerful engine used in the M4 Sherman. The result defied every assumption about what a tracked armored vehicle could do. On a good road, the M18 could reach 55 to 60 miles an hour. Across broken ground, it could still hold 40. A Panther, by comparison, struggled to reach 30 miles an hour on pavement and barely 10 across rough terrain before its crew risked throwing a track entirely. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had spent months learning to exploit that gap. Before it ever reached France, the battalion had trained on an older, clumsier vehicle, a gun motor carriage that struggled through the testing grounds of the American South, its crews wrestling with mechanical faults and awkward handling. But the battalion's testing record had been strong enough that when the M18 finally reached production, the 704th was among the first to receive it. Crews who had once cursed underpowered engines and stiff transmissions now found themselves behind the controls of something closer to a race car than a tank, and they had spent every spare hour since learning exactly what that machine could do. Inside each Hellcat, crouched in the tree line that morning, sat a crew of 5, a commander standing chest high in the open turret, a gunner and loader crammed into the fighting compartment below him, a driver and assistant driver forward in the hull. None of them wore the thick plate that a Panther crew took for granted. The M18's armor was thin enough that a heavy machine gun could pierce it at close range, a fact every man in the platoon understood without needing to be told twice. They had learned instead to trust distance, speed, and the fog itself, using the mist the same way a hunter uses tall grass, close enough to see the target, far enough to remain unseen. Leiper's driver kept one hand resting on the shift lever of the automatic transmission, an unfamiliar luxury borrowed from Buick's civilian designs, one that let him focus entirely on the ground ahead instead of wrestling with clutch and gears the way his German counterparts were forced to do. Positioned since before dawn near Rechicourt-la-Petite, Leiper's platoon waited in silence as the fog thickened around them, each crew scanning an assigned arc of the tree line, listening for the low grinding hum of approaching engines. The wait stretched on for hours, cold and damp, the kind of silence that made every distant sound feel closer than it was. At 7:15, Leiper caught sight of something through a gap in the mist. A German tank gun muzzle, no more than 30 feet away, sliding slowly into view. He gave the order without hesitation, and his platoon came alive. What happened next unfolded almost too quickly for either side to fully register it. An M18, engine roaring, went from a dead stop to 30 miles an hour in a matter of seconds, a burst of acceleration that would have taken a Panther nearly half a minute to match. It swung wide, found an angle on the exposed flank of the nearest German tank, and fired twice before the Panther's turret, heavy and slow on its hydraulic traverse, had rotated even halfway toward the threat. The Panther shuddered and began to burn. Before the smoke had cleared, a second Hellcat struck from another angle, then a third. In the span of 5 minutes, 5 Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade were destroyed, each one hit from an angle its crew never saw coming. The Americans lost 1 M18 in return, a trade so lopsided that even the men who had planned for exactly this outcome found themselves briefly stunned by how completely it had worked. For the German crews advancing blind through the fog, the engagement made no tactical sense. They had trained for years to fight exactly this kind of war, tank against tank, gun against gun, armor against armor, and they had won that war against the Soviets more often than they had lost it. Nothing in that experience had prepared them for an enemy that refused to stand and trade fire, an enemy that appeared, struck, and disappeared again before a response was even possible. The smell of burning fuel and scorched metal drifted through the fog, mixing with the wet earth smell of the fields, and somewhere behind the mist came the sound of another engine racing away before anyone could get a bearing on it. The commander who had watched his sister Panther burn 50 meters away understood, in that instant, that the morning's advance was not going to be the routine action his orders had promised. He gripped the edge of his cupola and scanned the gray wall in front of him, waiting for a shape, a muzzle flash, anything solid enough to aim at, and found nothing but drifting fog and the muffled echo of engines that seemed to come from every direction at once. Something had changed in the nature of the battle in front of him, and neither his training nor his years of experience on the Eastern Front had given him the tools to understand what it was. For the first time since the war began, he felt something closer to the enemy's fear than his own confidence, and the feeling would not leave him for the rest of the day. What had happened in those first 5 minutes was not luck, and it was not an accident of fog and timing alone. It was the product of a mismatch built into the two vehicles themselves, one that would repeat itself again and again through the rest of the morning and the days that followed. The Panther's turret, sheathed in thick sloped armor and mounting a long, high-velocity 75mm gun, weighed nearly 7 tons. Turning that mass through a full circle using its hydraulic traverse system took a full minute under ideal conditions, and under combat conditions, with the engine kept at low revolutions to avoid drawing attention, that traverse slowed even further. A Panther crew that spotted a threat to its flank might need 20 or 30 seconds simply to bring the main gun to bear, an eternity when the enemy could cross open ground at 30 miles an hour in that same span of time. The M18's turret, by contrast, weighed just over 2 tons, light enough to spin through a full rotation in a fraction of the time. Where an M10 tank destroyer, the M18's predecessor, had relied on a turret that crews had to rotate by hand, cranking it laboriously toward a target, the Hellcat's power traverse let a gunner track a moving vehicle almost as fast as he could turn his head. A Hellcat crew could acquire a target, fire, and already be moving to a new position before a Panther crew had finished locating where the shot had come from. It was not a difference of degree. It was a difference of kind, and it turned every engagement into a race the Germans did not know they were running. That imbalance extended to nearly every part of the two machines. The Panther's final drive, the mechanical assembly that transferred engine power to the tracks, had been engineered for a vehicle weighing roughly 35 tons. German designers had then piled additional armor onto the hull and turret until the finished Panther weighed closer to 45 tons, and the final drive, never redesigned to match, failed constantly under the strain. Crews joked bitterly that a Panther was as likely to break down chasing an enemy as to be destroyed by one. The M18 suffered no such flaw. Its air-cooled radial engine, adapted from an aircraft power plant, could run for hours under hard use with only minor maintenance, and its torsion bar suspension, a design borrowed from pre-war experiments that German engineers had pioneered but never fully exploited on this scale, absorbed the shock of rough ground well enough to let the vehicle hold speeds that would have shaken a leaf-sprung Panther apart. Even the way the two vehicles were serviced reflected the gap between the two philosophies. Buick's engineers had mounted the M18's engine on steel rollers so that a maintenance crew could disconnect it from the transmission, slide it out onto a lowered rear cover, service it in the open air, and reconnect it, The entire job finished in under 2 hours. Replacing a Panther's engine, by comparison, could consume an entire day of skilled labor, assuming the specialized tools and trained mechanics required for the job were even available near the front. And then there was the matter of communication. Every M18 carried an SCR 508 radio set, giving every vehicle in the platoon a reliable voice link to every other vehicle and to the units supporting them. German tank platoons typically shared a single radio among several vehicles, with the rest relying on signal flags, hand gestures, or pre-arranged maneuvers agreed upon before the engagement began. In the fog and chaos around Aricourt, that gap in communication multiplied every other American advantage. Hellcat crews could call out a target's position the instant they spotted it, warn each other of threats approaching from the flank, and adjust an entire platoon's tactics in the time it took to speak a sentence. German commanders, meanwhile, made decisions alone, guessing at what the rest of their unit could see and do. None of this had come as a surprise to the men who had designed the M18, because Aricourt was not the vehicle's first test under fire. Months earlier, in the spring of 1944, a handful of the Hellcat's earlier prototype models had been sent to the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion at the Anzio beachhead in Italy. The mountainous terrain and narrow roads of that campaign seemed, on paper, like the worst possible environment for a vehicle built around open ground and high-speed maneuver. Yet even there, the M18's capabilities had startled the German defenders who encountered it. Those early engagements remained scattered and local, their lessons never fully absorbed by a Wehrmacht fighting on multiple fronts at once, and the German army preparing to defend France against the coming invasion continued to focus its attention on the threat posed by American Sherman tanks and by the M10, an older and more conventional tank destroyer that, while faster than German armor, still fought within tactics the Germans understood. By the time the 704th reached Lorraine, with its M18s in September, the German army in the region was operating on assumptions that had already been proven false once, half a continent away, without anyone in the chain of command fully realizing it. The vehicle itself had an unusual pedigree for a weapon of war. Its distinctive shape had originated in the design studio of Harley Earl, a name better known for shaping the sweeping lines of pre-war American automobiles than for military engineering, working within General Motors' Buick division. Earl brought an automotive designer's instincts to the project, and the result looked and handled less like a traditional armored vehicle and more like a race car that happened to carry a cannon. That automotive lineage extended into the factory as well. Buick built the M18 using the same mass production methods and standardized components that had made American car manufacturing the envy of the industrial world, which meant that workers who had spent their careers assembling civilian automobiles needed only modest retraining to build Hellcats on the very same lines. German tank production could claim no such advantage. The Panther's Maybach engine was largely hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen, using specialized tools and materials that grew scarcer as the war dragged on, and every Panther that rolled out of a German factory represented a far larger investment of scarce skilled labor than its American counterpart. The M18 carried other refinements that mattered less in a specification sheet than they did in the middle of a firefight. Its fire control relied on a periscopic sight that the commander could operate independently of the turret itself, letting him search for new targets while his gunner remained focused on engaging the one directly in front of them. A Panther commander, by contrast, generally needed to rotate the entire turret simply to look around, a habit that slowed target acquisition and, just as dangerously, telegraphed the tank's presence and intentions to anyone watching from a distance. The Hellcat's ammunition was also stored in protective bins designed specifically to reduce the risk of a catastrophic explosion if the vehicle was penetrated, a detail that gave experienced crews a better chance of surviving a hit that might have destroyed a less carefully designed vehicle outright, and of climbing back into a replacement machine to fight again within days rather than being lost to the war entirely. None of these individual advantages would have mattered as much as they did without the industrial machine standing behind them. Production of the M18 had begun in July of 1943 and reached its peak in January of 1944, when Buick's Flint plant turned out roughly 250 vehicles in a single month. American factories, once running at full capacity, could replace every Hellcat lost in the fighting around Aracourt within a matter of days. German industry, hampered by Allied bombing, shortages of raw material, and the sheer complexity of building a vehicle like the Panther, managed at its absolute peak barely 380 tanks a month across every factory in the country, a figure that had to cover every front of the war at once, along with training vehicles and replacements for losses that were mounting everywhere simultaneously. The 39 Panthers destroyed in the fighting around Aracourt represented, by some wartime estimates, more than a full week of the Reich's entire tank production. It was a loss the Germans could ill afford to repeat, a full week's worth of national tank output erased in a single morning's fighting, and yet within days, they would be forced to. Nowhere was that coordination more apparent than in the tactics Captain Tom Evans employed as the morning wore on. Rather than allow his platoons to fight as isolated vehicles, Evans positioned one platoon of Company C where the Germans could see it, close enough to draw fire and hold the attention of the advancing Panthers, while two additional platoons of Hellcats worked their way unseen along the flanks. The lead platoon became bait, a visible target that the German tanks fixed on instinctively, their guns and their attention drawn toward the vehicles directly in front of them. They never noticed the machines closing in from the sides until it was too late to matter. It was tank destroyer doctrine executed almost exactly as its designers had imagined it years earlier at Fort Meade. One element holding the enemy's attention while the others maneuvered into position for a killing shot, and it worked with brutal efficiency against a brigade that had no answer for an enemy willing to split its forces this way. Among the platoon commanders who distinguished themselves that morning was Sergeant Henry R. Hartman, whose Hellcat alone accounted for 6 German tanks destroyed on the 19th of September, most of them Panthers. Hartman's method, as it came to be described afterward within the battalion, relied on using terrain, hedgerows, low rises, the drifting fog itself, to mask his approach until he was close enough to strike from an angle no Panther gunner could cover in time. He would fire, then displace immediately, never lingering in a position long enough to become a target himself. It was a technique that demanded precision and nerve in equal measure, since striking a Panther from the side or rear at close range left almost no room for a missed shot or a slow retreat. But Hartman and crews like his proved that when the technique was executed well, it could dismantle a heavier, more powerfully armed opponent almost effortlessly. The precision that technique demanded should not be understated. Hellcat gunners learned that a well-placed shot striking the narrow gap between a Panther's gun mantlet and its glacis plate could send the round ricocheting downward into the driving compartment, killing the crew inside or disabling the vehicle outright. But achieving that shot required closing to an extremely short range and holding steady long enough to place the round with real accuracy. Against a German tank that could traverse and fire back quickly, such a tactic would have amounted to suicide. Against Panthers whose turrets crawled through their traverse and whose crews often could not locate the source of incoming fire until it was too late, the same tactic became devastatingly effective. One more example of how the Hellcat's speed transformed a maneuver that should have been reckless into one that was merely bold. By noon on the 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade's attack had effectively stalled. Evans's platoons continued to press their advantage through the morning, destroying 10 additional German tanks for the loss of 2 more Hellcats. Elsewhere along the same stretch of front, Sherman tanks exploited the same poor deployment that had cost the Germans so dearly, catching a number of Panthers with their weaker side armor exposed and destroying 11 more vehicles in the process. The mathematics of the morning were, by any measure, staggering. Each Panther lost that day represented an enormous investment, roughly 117,000 Reichsmarks in cost, and something in the neighborhood of 2,000 man-hours of skilled labor to build, according to widely cited wartime estimates. Each M18, by comparison, had cost the United States government around $57,500 and required only about 500 man-hours to assemble on Buick's automotive production lines. Losing the tanks was one blow. Losing them at this exchange rate was another problem entirely, one that German war planners, already straining to keep pace with Allied production, could not easily absorb. As the fog began to lift toward 9 o'clock, and again through the following days, a second pattern became just as clear as the tactical one. German losses were not coming exclusively from American guns. A significant number of Panthers were abandoned or disabled during the fighting around Aracourt due to mechanical failure rather than enemy fire, their strained final drives giving out, or their transmissions overheating, as drivers pushed the engines hard, trying to catch up to an enemy that never stood still long enough to be caught. Crews who had trusted their machines through years of fighting in the East now found those same machines failing them at the worst possible moments, breaking down in the middle of maneuvers meant to save their lives. The psychological toll of these engagements went beyond the battlefield itself. Men who had survived the crushing tank battles around Kursk, who had faced Soviet T-34s and KV-1s in numbers that would have broken lesser crews, discovered in the fields around Aracourt something they had never encountered before, an enemy they could not effectively fight back against even when they understood, in general terms, what that enemy was doing. They could hear the Hellcat's engines from well over half a mile away in the quiet countryside, a distinctive high-pitched growl that carried across open fields, and yet knowing an attack was coming, did almost nothing to prepare them for it. By the time the sound registered as a threat rather than background noise, the American vehicles were often already crossing the final stretch of open ground, closing the distance in under a minute, too fast for German gunners to track with any confidence. As the 20th of September arrived, an additional German armor moved up to reinforce the battered 113th Brigade. The fighting around Aracourt only intensified, but the underlying pattern refused to change no matter how many fresh tanks the Germans committed. Reinforcing units arrived with the same confidence and the same doctrine that had failed their predecessors only a day earlier, rolling into the same fog-covered fields with the same assumptions, and they suffered similar losses for similar reasons. What had changed by this point was something harder to measure than a tank count. German tank crews were, for many of them, experiencing an emotion that years of hard fighting on the Eastern Front had never quite produced in them before. A persistent, corrosive fear of an enemy they could hear, dread, and still not effectively engage. These were men who had faced Soviet armor across the vast plains of Ukraine, who had endured the immense tank battles around Kursk and come away believing that German training and German engineering could overcome almost any numerical disadvantage. The Panther had stood as proof of that belief, a vehicle capable of destroying nearly any Allied tank while remaining difficult to kill in return. In the fields around Aracourt, that certainty did not merely weaken, it broke outright, and it would not be repaired for the rest of the campaign in the West, no matter how many fresh crews or fresh tanks arrived to replace what had already been lost. American tank destroyer units, meanwhile, showed a doctrinal flexibility that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid expectations still guiding German armor. The original concept behind the tank destroyer battalions had called for them to be held in reserve, moved forward only when a major enemy armored thrust required a rapid, concentrated response. In practice, that rigid scenario rarely materialized in the way its designers had imagined, and Hellcat crews increasingly found themselves supporting infantry divisions directly, providing mobile anti-tank cover and direct fire support in situations far removed from the mass tank battles the doctrine had originally envisioned. Rather than resist this improvisation, American commanders adapted their tactics continuously, developing new techniques for fighting in wooded terrain, in built-up towns, and along river crossings that the M18's designers had never specifically planned for. German Panzer units, bound by a doctrine that had served them well for years and offered no ready answer to what was unfolding in Lorraine, found themselves with far less room to improvise. On the 22nd of September, near the village of Coincourt, this pattern repeated itself in a new form. Hellcats sprinted directly across open ground at their maximum speed toward German positions, a tactic that would have been suicidal for almost any other armored vehicle of the war, but one the M18's speed made viable. The Panthers defending the position managed only a handful of hurried, poorly aimed shots before the Americans were already among them, too close and moving too fast for the German gunners to compensate. 2 days later, on the 24th of September, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a rising young officer commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, who would go on to a long and distinguished career in the post-war American Army, coordinated a joint attack with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion that showed just how far American tactics had evolved since the battle's opening morning. Sherman tanks advanced deliberately, drawing German attention and fire, their heavier armor better suited than the thin-skinned Hellcats to absorbing the opening exchanges of a fight, while the rest of the plan unfolded around them. While the Panthers focused on the visible threat in front of them, confident in the reach and power of their own guns, M18s used the same wooded terrain and dead ground that had shielded German advances earlier in the campaign to work their way around to the flanks and rear, moving through gaps in the tree line that no one on the German side had thought to watch closely enough. When the Hellcats broke from cover at multiple points simultaneously, the German tanks found themselves caught in a crossfire they had no coordinated way to answer, their guns still oriented toward the Shermans they had believed to be the only threat worth watching. Some German units, searching for any tactical response to an enemy that would not fight fair, began experimenting with pairing their Panthers back to back, each vehicle covering the other's blind side. The adaptation demanded that the tanks remain stationary to maintain the arrangement, surrendering the mobility that had once been the Panzer Force's greatest strength, and it assumed a level of coordination between vehicles that most German crews, without reliable radios, simply could not sustain under fire. Whatever advantage the tactic offered on paper evaporated the moment American forces adjusted their angle of attack even slightly, and the brigade's mounting losses continued largely unabated. What made the failure of that improvised tactic so telling was what it revealed about how completely the terms of engagement had shifted. A defensive posture built around standing still and covering every angle was, in essence, an admission that the Panther could no longer function as the offensive weapon it had been designed to be. Every hour that a Panther crew spent locked in a stationary pairing, watching for an attack that might come from any direction, was an hour surrendered entirely to American initiative. The M18s, never obligated to attack from a fixed direction or on a fixed schedule, could simply wait, probe, and choose their moment, confident that patience cost them nothing, while it cost the Germans everything. By the last days of September, officers within the 4th Armored Division's staff were already describing the fighting around Aricourt as a demonstration of principles that ran far beyond the immediate tactical situation, a case study in what happened when one side's entire theory of armored warfare collided directly with another's, and only one theory survived the encounter intact, a lesson the German command would be forced to confront openly within days. By the 25th of September, the answer finally reached the men who most needed to hear it. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the entire 5th Panzer Army, issued new instructions to the forces still contesting the ground around Aricourt, instructions that amounted to an open admission of defeat. Enemy tank destroyers of exceptional speed were operating in the sector, the order warned plainly, and German units were not to pursue them, not to engage them in any kind of mobile battle whatsoever. For a force built entirely around the idea of the tank as an offensive weapon, a machine meant to dominate the battlefield through speed of maneuver and concentration of firepower, the order reduced the once feared Panther to something close to a stationary pillbox, It surrendered every shred of initiative to the Americans and acknowledged, in language no officer wanted to put in writing, that German armor could no longer win the kind of war it had been designed to fight. When the fighting around Aracourt finally wound down, the ledger told its own story. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had knocked out 39 German tanks for the loss of 4 M18s destroyed and 3 more damaged, a kill ratio so lopsided that it would have seemed implausible to anyone who had not watched it happen in full view of an entire armored division. The battle validated the tank destroyer doctrine in the most dramatic way its designers could have hoped for, proving that a vehicle with barely enough armor to stop small arms fire could dominate opponents wrapped in some of the thickest steel of the war, so long as it never gave those opponents the fair fight they were prepared for. The lesson of Aracourt did not stay confined to Lorraine for long. 3 months later, in December of 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive in the West, a desperate gamble through the Ardennes that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. In its opening days, the attack achieved real surprise and broke through American lines at several points, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the initiative that German armor had lost at Aracourt might be reclaimed through sheer weight of numbers and the advantage of surprise. But wherever Hellcat-equipped battalions could be rushed to the threatened sectors in time, the same speed that had shattered the 113th Panzer Brigade proved decisive once again. At the town of Neuville, a battalion-sized task force known as Team d'Issobry, built around elements of the 10th Armored Division, was ordered to defend the position with whatever forces could reach it in time. Only 4 M18 tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were available to support the defense against advancing units of the 2nd Panzer Division, and those 4 vehicles made the journey to their blocking position by road at their full top speed, engines straining, racing to get ahead of a German armored column that was already moving toward the same crossroads. It stands as one of the few clearly documented instances of the war in which the Hellcat's remarkable top speed was used exactly as its designers had once imagined, not merely to strike and vanish in a single engagement, but to win an entire race against the clock before a shot had even been fired. Time and again during the Ardennes fighting, M18s reached blocking positions ahead of advancing German spearheads, disrupting timetables that German commanders had built entirely around the assumption that no American unit could possibly arrive first. The final numbers compiled from the fighting across the European theater told a story that would have seemed unbelievable to the confident German crews who had rolled into Aracourt back in September. Across the war, M18 crews were credited with roughly 526 enemy vehicles destroyed, the overwhelming majority of them in Europe, against a loss of 216 Hellcats destroyed in combat, a kill-to-loss ratio of better than 2 to 1, among the best recorded by any American armored vehicle of the war. Those figures were made more remarkable still by the fact that the M18 had spent much of its service life performing improvised roles far removed from the tank hunting mission its designers had originally intended, providing direct fire support to infantry far more often than it fought the kind of massed armored duels that had defined its combat debut at Aracourt. The contrast between the Panther and the M18, in the end, reflected 2 entirely different conclusions drawn from the same lesson. German engineers had studied Soviet armor, admired its sloped plating and powerful gun, and built something similar but heavier and more powerful still, an evolutionary response that pushed an existing idea to its logical extreme. American designers, confronting that same fundamental problem of how to survive against a heavily armored enemy, reached the opposite conclusion entirely. The best protection a crew could have, they decided, was never being hit in the first place. The M18 was not a smaller, cheaper imitation of a tank. It was a rejection of what a tank was assumed to need to be, a vehicle built around evasion rather than endurance, and at Aracourt, in the fog and confusion of a single September morning, it had proven that revolutionary thinking could overturn even the most refined evolutionary design. Those closing figures rested on a mechanical foundation that few outside the battalion ever fully appreciated. Across its brief production run, the M18 maintained a mechanical readiness rate that armored crews of the era considered remarkable, a machine that could be counted on to start each morning and keep running through a full day of hard use, something the Panther, for all its firepower, had never quite managed to guarantee its own crews. That reliability meant experienced Hellcat crews stayed in the fight, learning and refining their tactics engagement after engagement, while German crews were forced again and again to break in replacement vehicles and, all too often, replacement men. That lesson outlived the war itself. Decades later, officers who had once served the Wehrmacht and gone on to advise the newly formed West German military in the 1950s, evaluating American armor for possible adoption, consistently recommended against heavy tank designs and in favor of the kind of mobile, fast-moving systems the M18 had pioneered. Surveys of German tank veterans, conducted long after the war, found that many of them named the Hellcat, rather than any heavier American tank or any ground attack aircraft, as the most feared Allied weapon they had faced. A small, thin-skinned vehicle that had somehow broken a confidence built across years of victories in the East. The philosophy that Bruce and his engineers had first sketched out at Fort Meade back in 1941 did not end with the M18 either. Later generations of armored vehicles, from Israel's Merkava to the American M1 Abrams to Germany's own post-war Leopard 2, drew directly on lessons the Hellcat had proven under fire, that mechanical reliability, coordinated communication, and superior situational awareness could matter as much in a tank fight as raw armor thickness or gun size. Those later tanks carried far heavier armor than the M18 ever had, but each still valued speed and agility to a degree that would have struck a 1944 German tank designer as an unnecessary indulgence. Proof that the revolution begun in the fog at Aracourt had never really ended, only spread quietly into every armored vehicle that came after it. According to accounts passed down within the battalion's veteran community, a reunion was held at Aracourt in 1985, bringing veterans from both sides back to the same quiet fields where the fog had once hidden death on every side. The ground looked nothing like it had in 1944. The hedgerows had grown, the scorched earth had long since turned green again, and where burning Panthers had once marked the horizon, there was now only open farmland, quiet enough that the men walking it could hear their own footsteps. American and German veterans, elderly by then, some walking with canes, some leaning on the arms of grown children who had come to see the place their fathers rarely spoke about, moved together across ground that had swallowed dozens of tanks and dozens of lives 4 decades earlier, and spoke plainly, many of them for the first time, about what had happened there. As part of the ceremony, a restored M18 was driven across the field, its engine turning over with the same distinctive growl that had once carried across these fields at dawn. Even after 40 years, it still reached something close to its old top speed, closing the distance in the same short handful of seconds that had once given German gunners no time to react. The engine's roar carried across the same open ground where Sergeant Hartmann and Lieutenant Leiper's platoons had once turned that speed into a weapon no Panther could answer. Several of the German veterans in attendance stood in silence as it passed, some of them instinctively bracing at the sound, old reflexes surfacing before they could stop them, watching a machine that had once seemed impossible to understand, still moving exactly as they remembered it, still faster than anything they had ever managed to build. What had happened at Aracourt, and again later at Nouville, and along the roads leading to the Rhine, was never only a matter of one weapon defeating another. It was a demonstration that in war, as in so much else, survival does not always belong to the side with the thickest armor or the most powerful gun, but often to the side willing to ask a different question entirely. The M18 Hellcat had answered that question at 55 miles an hour, in the fog, with a 76mm gun and almost no armor to speak of, and the German tankers who survived the encounter carried the answer with them for the rest of their lives, whether or not they ever found the words to fully explain it, long after the fields at Aracourt had gone quiet again.